Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
My parents told me for years that there was no money for college, not a little, not a loan with their names on it, not even a promise that if I kept my grades up they would try to meet me halfway. Just that flat sentence about timing and bills and how the economy had been rough. So I stacked shifts at a coffee place and a call center. I filled out scholarship forms until my hands cramped. And I learned how to make every small thing last twice as long as it should because the only way out was through. And then last month my phone lit up with a photo from my brother grinning next to a brand new sports car in our parents' driveway, with the caption, "They said I deserve it, and I swear to you." I could hear the sound of something old and heavy snapping in my head even though I was just standing in my kitchen drinking a reheated coffee that had already gone bitter. I stared at that photo like it was a test I had already failed, because it was not just a car, it was a scoreboard that made every memory line up and choose sides. It was the day in high school when I brought home an acceptance letter and Mom said she was proud, but the timing was bad. It was the semester I took an extra class to graduate sooner while Dad told me that debt builds character. It was all the times my brother forgot consequences and somebody else picked up the pieces while I was reminded to be responsible, and it landed with the kind of thud you do not ignore, because the truth is not shy once you finally look it in the face. I called my mom, because I wanted it to be a joke, and I wanted her to say it was a lease for a weekend or some promotional thing from the dealership. And she answered on the second ring with that bright voice she uses when there is company and said how happy she was to hear me and asked if I had seen the car, and before I could catch myself I said, "Yes, I saw the car. And I also saw the messages from the years when there was supposedly no money, and I just need you to tell me how those things can both be true." And there was this little pause like she was reaching for a story that would land softly, and then she said, "Honey, it is different with your brother. He has so much potential and this will help him." And maybe that sounds harmless if you do not know our history, but to me it sounded exactly like every time I was useful when I was quiet and a problem when I needed anything at all. What people do not tell you about favoritism is that it hides inside reasonable sentences, and it wears the kind of smile you are trained to accept, and you learn to say it is fine because calling it out gets you labeled dramatic or jealous or ungrateful. And I have tried every version of being easy about it. I have laughed at jokes that were not funny. I have brought desserts to dinners where I spent the evening listening to my brother's latest plan. I have told myself they are doing their best, but when I heard my mom tell me that it was different with him, something tired in me stood up, and I said, "Got it, so there was money, just not for me." And she gasped like I had slapped her when all I did was hold up the mirror she had been avoiding. I hung up before she finished her sentence because I could hear the pivot coming, the one where she says I am taking this the wrong way and that they have always supported me emotionally and that money is complicated and I am not 18 anymore. I do not need to sit through the whole monologue to know how it ends, and I thought I would cry or shake, but instead I opened the family group text and scrolled back through a year of things I had let go. The time my brother missed a rent payment, and Dad swooped in with not a lecture but a transfer. The time Mom posted that she wished I saw how much they tried when what she meant was that she wished I would stop noticing the difference. And I looked at the new photo again and realized that the best thing I could do for myself was to stop pretending this was a misunderstanding. So I did something small that felt like oxygen, and maybe it will sound petty to someone who has never had to swallow the same medicine for years, but it was the first step that belonged to me, and it was clean and it was quiet, and it did not require a fight. I saved the photo and I saved a dozen old texts where I had been told there was no money, and then I posted nothing, I called no one, I did not ignite a scene. I simply replied in the family thread, "Good to know where the budget ended up. Congrats," and I added a little heart because that is the language they understand, the language of appearances, and then I left the group with one tap, and the silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt like the door I had needed for a very long time. Do you know what happened next? Because this part still makes me laugh in a way that is not pretty, the kind of laugh that comes up from your ribs after you have held your breath for too long. My brother texted me separately with a voice message where he tried to sound concerned, but could not resist bragging about the features and how our parents said he had earned it after a tough year. And in the same breath, he asked if I was free to help him with insurance paperwork because he hates forms. And I listened to that message twice, not because I needed the details, but because it told me everything I needed to know about how the next few weeks would look, and I decided I was done being helpful in ways that erased me. I called my dad, because if I was going to say the thing that finally cut the cord, I wanted him to hear it in my voice, and when he picked up I told him I would not be coming by for Sunday dinners for a while, and I would not be available for last-minute favors. And I would not be pretending I was fine, and he said I was overreacting and that the car was a gift and that life is not fair, and I said you are right, life is not fair, which is why I am done playing the part that keeps your version of fair looking tidy. And he told me I was being ungrateful and that I would regret making everything about money, and I said it is not about money, it is about the message, and then he said something I will not repeat because it was meant to land like a punch. And instead of arguing, I hung up and blocked his number for the evening just to give myself a night without the next volley. Here is the part you will either judge me for or finally understand me for, and I can live with both, because I slept well for the first time in months, and when I woke up I wrote a short, polite message to my mom that said I would not be at her birthday dinner, that I hoped she had a lovely time, and that I needed space, and I hit send without rereading it, and then I went into my contacts and I changed the name of the family thread I had left to a note in my phone that says, "No" is a complete sentence, because if I was going to keep my sanity, I needed a reminder I could hold in my hand, and while I was writing that note, a new call came through from an unknown number that I knew was not unknown at all, because when my family wants something, they rotate phones and stories until they get the yes they are used to, and this time I let it ring and I did not answer, and if you want to know what I did instead, and whether I left it at that or whether I made a move they would actually feel, then you should hear what I sent next, because I promise you it was the first cut they did not see coming. When I tell you that the car was not the beginning but the punchline, I mean that every year before it had been a rehearsal where I was expected to clap on cue, because the pattern was steady and boring and somehow still managed to hurt. The kind of favoritism that does not announce itself loudly but shows up in ordinary choices, like birthdays where my gifts were practical and as were exciting, like school nights where my late study session was be self-sufficient and his missed homework was let's talk to the teacher, like the way I was coached to be understanding while he was coached to be special, and by the time the car rolled into the driveway all it did was turn the volume up on a song I already knew by heart. I started making a list, not because I needed proof for myself. I have lived in this family long enough to know the difference between a hard season and a habit, but because I wanted to see whether there was any part of me that was misremembering, whether I was making a mountain out of something a decent person would let go, and the list did not shrink anything, it clarified it. It put years into one neat column. The Christmas when I was told we were doing small gifts and he unwrapped concert tickets and the latest console while I got a planner and a book about budgeting. The summer when I took an unpaid internship and asked to borrow the car twice a week and was told gas was expensive while he took a week-long trip with friends funded by a mysterious supportive envelope. The weekend he totaled his hand-me-down and my dad explained that accidents happen and insurance exists and character is built through grace, which was an impressive speech I never heard delivered to me when I stumbled. It is funny how people who treat you a certain way also manage to convince you that calling it what it is will make you the villain. So you learn to keep the tone light and the feelings tidy, and you become useful because usefulness buys you a little peace. And then one day you are holding a photo of a car and a memory of a message that said there was no money for you, and the math stops working, and you decide that if someone is going to be the villain in their story, it might as well not be you anymore, and instead you will be the person who finally stops doing the unpaid job of keeping everyone comfortable. I did not storm the house or write a long speech. I started where the pattern lived, which was access and expectation, the quiet ways I kept their world running. I removed my card from the streaming accounts I had set up for family movie nights that turned into brother worship sessions. I closed the shared cloud folder where I stored copies of important documents for them because they were always losing passwords. I changed the settings on the family calendar I had created years ago so that I no longer received notifications for their appointments and errands, and I wrote one clear text to my mom that said I would not be planning or paying for her birthday dinner this year, that I hoped her friends would celebrate her well. and that I would not be attending because I needed distance until the college and car issue stopped being a topic I was expected to swallow. You would think that a normal response would be to ask what I needed or to at least admit the obvious, but instead my dad left a voicemail that started out measured and slid quickly into the old script about gratitude and family obligations, with a little warning tucked in about how I was about to regret this resistance, which was a phrase that told me he was not listening. He was defending a system where I did the work and smiled about it, and nothing motivates me like a threat dressed up as advice, so I sat down and wrote a short, careful message to the handful of relatives who reliably call me to intervene when there is a family spat, the aunt who loves back-channel diplomacy, the cousin who thinks he is Switzerland, the family friend who always says we should all be kind, and I told them I would not be attending the birthday, that I would appreciate no more guilt calls, and that, to answer the question I knew they would ask, yes, there had been money for a car and there had not been money for my college, and yes, I had the messages to prove it, and no, I did not need anyone to choose a side. I only needed them to stop acting like I was unreasonable for finally choosing mine. I did not attach screenshots, because I was not trying to start a bonfire. I was setting up a sprinkler system around my sanity, but I mentioned dates, and I mentioned the exact words, no money. And I said the sentence I had never said out loud to anyone in the family. If you call me to manage their feelings without addressing the facts, I will end the call, and if you keep trying, I will block your number, and you can think whatever you want about me. I will be fine. And then I took the spare key to my parents' house, the one I kept for emergencies and last-minute errands I was always so good about. I put it in a plain padded envelope with a short note that said, I am not available for drop-in tasks anymore. Please do not show up at my place without asking, and I mailed it with tracking so there would be no dramatic claim of lost mail. The funny thing about boundaries is that people call them cruel when they have benefited from your lack of them, so within a day the messages started. 3 versions of surprise and 2 versions of moralizing and 1 half-hearted attempt at empathy that still managed to center my parents' embarrassment. And under all of it was the same refusal to name the one event that had made the rest of it impossible to keep tolerating, and in that noise I heard the quiet thing I had been waiting for, which was my own clarity, and with that clarity I decided to do one more thing that would register not as a tantrum, but as a change in the rules. I went to my HR portal and removed my parents as emergency contacts, because the person who treats you like a backup generator does not get to be the first call if you land in a hospital, and I listed my best friend instead, the one who never once told me I was overreacting when I was just reacting. Was any of this dramatic? Not really, it was housekeeping, but it was the kind that costs the people in charge comfort, which is why it felt like revenge even though it looked like paperwork, and that night, because I knew the next act would not be quiet forever, I backed up the messages about the car and the old no money threads and I moved them to a folder labeled, for when they call me a liar, and I slept again, and then in the morning there was a message from my brother that tried to play peacemaker while still calling the car a reasonable decision, and a separate message from my mom that said we should talk before the birthday because she was open to hearing me out if I kept my tone respectful, which was code for let me talk first and let me set the terms, and I stared at those words and realized I had one move that would not involve yelling or public scenes, but would change the balance in a way they would feel in their bones, and I opened a different folder on my laptop. The one with the paperwork from a relative who had passed years ago, the one that had a small clause my parents always treated like a family formality, and I said out loud to no one, fine, if everything is different with my brother, then I will make something different too, and I clicked compose on an email to the only person who could help me pull it off quickly, because the conversation at that birthday was about to tilt in a direction they would not see coming. The email I wrote was short and careful because I knew that with my family, anything that sounded emotional would be dismissed as a phase, and anything that sounded measured would make them nervous. So I sent a note to the attorney who handled my late great-aunt's estate, the one who always spoke to me like I was the adult in the room when most people still addressed me as if I were my mother's assistant, and I asked 2 questions that I already knew the answers to from the original paperwork. Whether I, as a named beneficiary of a small education bequest that my parents referred to as a family pot for the next generation, could redirect my portion without their approval, and whether that change, once filed, would generate a boring letter in the mail that no one could pretend was a misunderstanding, and the attorney replied the next morning with the kind of crisp sentence that feels like a seatbelt, yes and yes, and attached a one-page form that required my signature and a paragraph for my stated intent. I sat with that form for an hour because I wanted my move to be clean, no spite, no showboating, just a line that could not be argued away. And I wrote that my share of the educational bequest would go to a small scholarship fund at my old community college for women who were the first in their families to pursue a degree, with priority for those paying their own tuition while working. And I listed 3 conditions that made the point without ever using my family's names: that recipients would be chosen by the college, that the award would be paid directly to the bursar, and that no acknowledgement would be sent to anyone except me, and I signed it and scanned it and sent it back with a thank you. And by midday the attorney confirmed receipt and said the notification letters to all parties would be mailed within the week. If you think that sounds small, you are right. It was not a car, it was not a billboard. It was a decision about a few $1,000s that to my parents had always been treated like a future toy chest for their favored child, and to me had always looked like a way to quietly do what they never did, which was back someone who was told to make it on her own and did it anyway. And maybe that sounds righteous or sentimental, but here is the truth that kept me steady while my phone started lighting up with calls I did not answer. I wanted my first act to be impossible to undo and boring to fight about, a change processed by a clerk and stamped by a machine, no drama for them to hijack. I also took care of the smaller threads that had kept me woven into their daily lives in ways that served everyone but me, because you cannot pull one cord and leave the rest knotted, so I logged into the insurance portal where, years ago, I had added my brother as an occasional driver on the old sedan I owned during school, a favor that somehow never got undone when he stopped needing it, and I removed him. Not out of malice, but because I had no interest in subsidizing premiums for a person who could park a sports car on my parents' driveway while lecturing me about family unity. And then I opened a note where I keep passwords, and I deleted the ones tied to my mother's streaming habits. Not to punish her, but to stop being her on-call tech support when I could not get a simple admission out of her that what they had done was not just thoughtless, it was patterned. By the time afternoon turned into evening, the expected outreach began, a text from my cousin that started with, "Hey, are you okay?" and immediately pivoted into, "Your mom is really upset and thinks there has been a misunderstanding." A call from a number I recognized as my dad's office line because he rotates through phones when he wants me to pick up, and finally a voicemail from my mom that started with a trembling apology for any confusion and then steered into a lecture about tone and respect and how families work through things. And I listened to it once, I saved it, and then I sent one text in return that said, "I will talk when you can say out loud that there was money for a car and there was not money for my education. And until then I need space." And I set my phone face down and made dinner in silence, because sometimes the most grown-up thing you can do is let an unanswered message do its job. 2 days later, the letters landed, because the attorney had not been bluffing about speed, and I did not see my parents open theirs, but I did see the fallout arrive in real time through a series of clumsy attempts to reverse the tide, my mom calling with a high, tight voice to say that Aunt Laura would be devastated if her name were used this way, which was funny because Aunt Laura always told me to ignore the noise and follow the paper, my dad sending a concise email with a subject line that read, "Reconsider," as if I were an employee and he were my manager, and my brother, bless his lack of self-awareness, sending a string of messages framed like peacekeeping that all circled the same complaint that I had made our parents look bad over. What amounts to a family gift with a bow on it, which is the closest he has ever come to saying the word car like it was not sacred. I did not argue, I did not defend. I sent one reply to each of them that said the exact same sentence, copied and pasted so there could be no debate about tone. This is a final decision, and it is not up for discussion. And then, because I know my family prefers optics to substance, I left one breadcrumb in a place I knew they watched, a short post on my professional page thanking my mentors and friends for being the ones who invested in me when it was hardest, and noting that I was paying it forward with a small scholarship for students who were told to go it alone, and I named no one, and I tagged no one, and I did not enable comments. And the silence that followed from my family's accounts was louder than any argument because it meant they had nothing clean to say without admitting the thing they refused to say. That night I slept like someone who had finally moved out of a house where every door stuck and every room smelled like old arguments, and in the morning there was a new message waiting from my mom that did not ask, it demanded. That I come to her birthday dinner so we could clear the air before this becomes permanent, and I read it 3 times because it told me everything I needed to plan the next move, which would not be noisier, it would just be unmistakable. And if you are wondering whether I walked into that dinner empty-handed and let them talk me into another round of selective memory, you do not know me anymore, because this time I came with a folder, and when the bread basket hit the table, I put my folder down beside it and said the one sentence that would change the entire conversation, and if you want to hear what happened after that, you will want to sit for the next part, because that was the moment the room finally stopped pretending. When I agreed to show up at that dinner, I knew they believed it was the moment they could regain control of the narrative, the carefully rehearsed scene where they would frame my reaction as an overstep, where my presence would be taken as an unspoken admission that deep down I understood they were right, and that I simply needed a little push to rejoin the family script. What they did not know, and what I made sure to keep from them until the first bread basket landed on the table, was that I had no intention of playing the part they had written for me, because I had spent enough years knowing my lines in their drama, reciting them on cue, and leaving the stage with the uneasy feeling that I had agreed to a version of myself that did not actually exist. The restaurant they picked was one they had used for every important family discussion since I was a teenager, a neutral space where they could keep voices low, appearances polished, and emotions contained in a way that looked respectable to anyone sitting at the next table. I arrived a few minutes late on purpose, not to make a scene, but because I wanted them already seated, comfortable, leaning into the expectation that they were running the evening. I walked in carrying my folder, a plain black one without any logos or labels, and I could see my mother's eyes flick to it, and then quickly away, the way you glance at something you do not understand yet and hope to ignore until you can figure out if it matters. My father, of course, had the smug half-smile of a man convinced that his reasonable tone was going to win the day, and my brother was there too, scrolling his phone as if he were here under protest, already bored with the idea of any real conversation. I didn't order a drink. I didn't make small talk. I waited until the waiter left with the menus, and then I set the folder on the table, slid it forward until it was centered between us, and said, without raising my voice, "This is why I don't visit anymore." My father leaned back immediately, that little theatrical move he always makes when he wants to signal that he is in control, and said, "We're not here to rehash old grievances, we're here to find a way forward." My mother gave a little nod in agreement, already preparing her bridge-building phrases, the ones that always end up making me feel like I am walking across something that leads right back to where we started. But before either of them could get into full rhythm, I opened the folder and pulled out the first page, a printout of every tuition payment receipt I made from my own account, starting from my first semester, with dates and amounts neatly highlighted. I slid those forward and watched as their eyes flicked down and then back up to me, clearly trying to decide if this was just a symbolic gesture or something they were going to have to take seriously. Without pausing, I added the second stack, screenshots of our old text exchanges, the ones where I had asked about help for tuition or books or housing, and had been told in various phrasings that there was no money right now, or that things were tight, or that, "You know we'd help if we could, but you're so independent." I didn't speak while they looked. I didn't fill the silence. I let the discomfort stretch long enough for my brother to finally glance over and mutter, "What is this supposed to prove?" That was when I added the last page, printed in sharp black and white, the one I knew would stick like a splinter they couldn't work out, the screenshot of my brother's own social media post with the dealership invoice visible in the background. The one he'd thought was cropped out but wasn't, showing the full price of the car they had purchased for him, complete with the date, just a few weeks before my final year's tuition payment had come due. I didn't look at my brother when I said, "What it proves is that you told me there was no money when there was, and you made a choice about who deserved it." My father's jaw tightened, and I could see him trying to decide whether to go for the defensive denial or the paternal guilt trip, but for once, neither option seemed to come easily. My mother opened her mouth twice, closed it twice, and finally said, "We thought you were fine on your own." It was the closest thing to an admission I was ever going to get, but it was still wrapped in the same logic that had kept this imbalance alive my entire life. The idea that my ability to survive without their help was somehow justification for never offering it, while my brother's neediness was a reason to shower him with resources and excuses. I could have pushed harder in that moment, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "You're right. I am fine on my own. That's exactly why I don't need to be here pretending this is just a misunderstanding." Then I closed the folder, placed it back in my bag, and stood up. My father asked where I was going, his voice finally losing that smoothness he always thought was unshakable. I told him I had given them the truth, and what they chose to do with it was up to them, but I wasn't going to sit through another dinner where the goal was to make me doubt my own memory. I left before the food arrived, not to make a scene, but because I didn't owe them the courtesy of staying after making my point. Walking out, I could feel their eyes on my back, and I knew they would spend the rest of the meal debating how to spin this to themselves and to anyone who asked. But what I also knew, and what made me calmer than I had been in months, was that there was no version of events they could tell that would erase what was in that folder. They could call me bitter, they could call me ungrateful, they could even try to paint me as unstable, but they could never again pretend I didn't know the truth, because now it had been laid out, in black and white, right in front of them. By the time I got home, my phone had already lit up with a message from my mom, a carefully worded paragraph about how she wished I hadn't left, how this was all a learning moment, and how family should focus on healing. I didn't reply. I didn't even read it twice. I put my phone face down, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in the quiet. Because the real power of what I had done wasn't in getting them to admit anything that night, it was in making it impossible for them to pretend I didn't see it. And I knew that the next move would not be about proving myself to them anymore. It would be about making sure they understood, in a way that went beyond words, that the door they kept assuming was still open was already locked from my side. After that dinner, where the folder did the talking I had begged them for years to hear, I went home and realized the part of me that had always waited for their apology was finally quiet, not because I had given up on being treated fairly, but because I had stopped outsourcing justice to people who could not even say the word mistake without choking on it, and in that quiet I understood that my last move could not be about catching them in another contradiction or forcing them to say sorry. Into a phone, it had to be something that proved to me that I no longer needed their approval or their permission, while giving them the one clear path back if they ever decided that truth mattered more to them than image. So I did something that looked small from the outside and felt huge from the inside. I made a few calls to the community college where I had started, the one that saved me when I had more determination than cash. And I asked if the modest scholarship paperwork could be finalized with a simple public thank you event on campus, nothing flashy, just a short acknowledgement for donors and recipients. Because I wanted to put a line in the world that could not be erased by dinner table narratives, and the coordinator, who remembered me from when I was juggling classes and 2 jobs, said they would be honored, and that they would send a brief announcement to the local newsletter that families actually read, and I said yes. And I wrote the exact words I wanted in that blurb, that a former student who had paid her own way was establishing a small fund for first-generation women balancing work and tuition, and that the award would be paid directly to the bursar to keep things simple, and that the donor would say a few words of thanks to the teachers and friends who invested when others did not. I did not invite my parents, because invitations are for people who have earned your presence, but I knew the announcement would find them, and I knew the timing would hurt in the way truth hurts when it is finally unavoidable. And on the day of the event, I stood at a lectern that had held 1,000 practical speeches before mine, and I said exactly what I meant without raising my voice or decorating my sentences. I said that I had been told there was no money for my education and that I learned how to keep going anyway, that I had received help from mentors and friends who believed in effort more than optics, and that I wanted to honor that by giving the next person one fewer barrier to climb. And I thanked the staff and I thanked the donors who had matched my small fund with their own gifts after seeing the announcement, and then I stepped aside while two students, both working nights to keep their enrollment, accepted the first awards. And the applause was not about me. Which was the point, because the best revenge is not torching the house, it is building your own with doors that only open from the inside. By that evening, the family text threads I was no longer in were buzzing, which I learned through cousins who tend to forward everything out of habit, and the messages had the exact flavor I expected. A mix of, why would she do this publicly, and, she is trying to humiliate us, and it was just a car, which made me laugh in that dry way I seem to specialize in now, because none of them could quote a single sentence from my speech where I named them, since I had not, and none of them could deny the facts, since I had printed them and laid them on a table, so the only trick left was to act like the problem was my volume rather than their choices, and I let them do that dance without joining. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from my father, short and crisp, in which he did not apologize, but did propose a reset, the kind of managerial word he loves. And he outlined a plan that sounded less like accountability and more like a schedule for forced niceness, monthly dinners and holiday attendance, and a promise that future gifts will be discussed with fairness in mind. And I sat with that letter long enough to identify the feeling it gave me, which was not anger and not sadness, just the old exhaustion that comes from being invited to a meeting where everyone pretends the fire is out while the room still smells like smoke. And I decided if they wanted terms, I would give them terms, not to control them, but to protect myself and to make the price of re-entry match the weight of what had been denied. My reply was 1 page, and it did not blink. I wrote that I had no interest in monthly dinners or photo-op holidays or any kind of reset that required me to forget what had already been proven, and I wrote that if they wanted to build something real, they could start by acknowledging, in writing, that there had been money for a sports car and not for my tuition, and that they had chosen to fund my brother while telling me there was nothing to give, and that they understood why that choice made me step back. And then I added the only condition that mattered to me, which was not a check to me and not a payment plan and not a public apology. I asked for a single act that would measure what they valued more. I wrote that if they wanted the door unlocked, they could match my scholarship for the next 2 years, paid directly to the bursar just like mine, with no speeches and no naming rights and no credit beyond the receipts, because if their defense had always been that I was fine on my own, and that my brother needed help, then they would have no problem helping strangers who were standing where I once stood. I sent that letter certified, the way adults send things when they need a record, and then I waited without chewing my nails, because waiting is different when you have already chosen yourself. And about a week later, my mother called from a number I had not blocked and asked if I was serious and whether I would really hold the family hostage over this, and I said quietly that I was not holding anyone hostage. I was simply saying that the cost of my presence was honesty plus action, and if that felt like ransom to them, they were free to decline, and then I ended the call before the script could spool up again. They did not write the check that week or the next, and I did not follow up, because the point was not to extract money from people who had taught me exactly what not to expect. The point was to put the only bridge that would ever be safe over the river they had dug, and to make sure it was built from something other than my patience and life, as it tends to do when you stop begging it to be different. Moved forward without asking for permission, I kept working. The scholarship recipients sent little notes through the college that made me smile in a way nothing from my family had made me smile in years, and my phone was blessedly quiet except for the occasional attempt from my brother to explain that I had embarrassed everyone over a gift. And I ignored those the way you ignore a car alarm in a parking lot once you realize it is just loud, not important. Then, a month later, an envelope arrived from the college with 2 copies of a receipt, one for a donation matching mine and one for the second installment pledged for the following year, both made from an account with my parents' names. And I sat at my kitchen table and looked at those receipts for a long time, not because I suddenly felt healed, but because I felt something better than vindication. I felt that the terms I set were real enough to be met or rejected, and that they had chosen to meet them, even if the letter that came a day later tried to package the act as a step toward harmony instead of what it actually was, which was proof that they could, when pressed by reality instead of comfort, choose fairness over favoritism. I did not run to their house. I did not plan a reunion dinner. I sent a brief note that said I had received the receipts and that I appreciated the action, and that for now I would keep my distance while we both learned how to live with what had happened and what it cost, and I ended with the only sentence that fully closed the loop. I wrote that I was willing to meet for coffee in a public place after the second installment cleared, not because I needed more money for strangers to feel okay, but because I wanted to see them prove that consistency was not a one-day performance. And then I put the letter in the mailbox and I went back to my life, which has gotten quiet and sturdy in ways I did not know were available to me. If you are waiting for some big cinematic ending where I forgive everything over a slice of cake, that is not the story I am telling, because my ending is simpler and, to me, sharper. My ending is that I stopped attending a family I had to audition for every day. I set terms that put truth above tradition, and I watched the people who said there was no money find a way to fund fairness when the alternative was losing access to a daughter who had learned how to be fine without them. And if there is a moral here, it is only this: that peace is not something they hand you after a speech. It is something you buy by refusing to pay for everybody else's comfort anymore. And on the day I realized that, the visits that had already ended in my head ended in real life too, not as a scream, not as a door slam, but as a final move that put me on my own side for good. And if you are wondering whether I regret any of it, I will tell you straight: I regret only how long it took me to make it this clear.